All right, so now we're heading into our final presentation. My good friend Matt Monk, who has been instrumental in helping put this conference together, basically him and I and a couple of people from marketing. And so I appreciate you, Matt. Thank you very much. So Matthew Monk is a craft and material culture historian and museum professional, as well as a PhD candidate in the history of American civilization at the University of Delaware. His dissertation, A Usable Appalachian Past, the Southern Highland Craft Guild, Commercialized Craft Tourism, and Ethno-Regionalized American Identity Creation between 1893 and 1961. This uses material cultural analysis to recast and recontextualize the progressive and New Deal era histories of the Appalachian Craft Revival and the history of the Southern Highland Craft Guild as early regional examples of national efforts to develop what Alan Eaton called the rural handicraft movement in America. Monk is a graduate adjunct history teacher at the University of Delaware, as well as grant writer for the Southern Highland Craft Guild. He has an MA in Decorative Arts and Design and History from the Smithsonian GWU program and an MA in Medieval Studies from the University of Toronto. His work and research examines the histories. His work and research examine the histories and relationships between 20th century regionalized American craft revivals and mass tourism development to better understand how these histories and relationships work together to shape, control, commercialize ethno-nationalistic cultural identities. Matthew has worked with numerous cultural institutions and museums, including the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, the architect of the U.S. Capitol, Museum of Fine Arts Boston, NC Museum of Art, and Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts. Please give a warm welcome to Matt Monk.
I would first like to say that I'm not going to talk for an hour. This is an abbreviated version, so this won't be too long, I promise. All right, so thank you so much for that introduction, Mike. I really appreciate it, and thank you everybody for coming to the conference today. This has been a real passion project. I'm super happy to see that the Guild leaning into its educational mission and producing scholarship again. So yay. So today I'm going to wrap the conference up by talking a little bit about and de-regionalizing the very regionalized history of the Southern Highland Craft Guild and the Appalachian Craft Revival. Again, just to kind of frame things, this is Lucy Morgan and Tony Ford, with the little cabin on the back of the truck that she drives all the way to Chicago to the World's Fair without having any ticket or any admission or anything. And she goes and she pesters people and she's begs them. And they're like, we don't really have any room for you. So finally she takes a little spot, backs that truck into it, and literally sells it out. So just keeping that in mind, this sort of regionalized presentation of craft revival. It's very intentional that she built this log cabin. It's very intentional the way that this is presented. It's very much regionalized, but the things that are going on in the crafts that are being made, some of them are regionalized, but by and far they've been commercialized, they've been standardized, and they've been made ready for mass modern consumption in the 20th century. So some foundational themes, and maybe some caveats. This is a recontextualization, not a revision. So there's been a lot of really wonderful historical work coming from Guild members, from people like Anna Ferriello. There's been excellent scholarship throughout the years. It has tended to look inward. It's tended to focus on what's happening with Appalachian people in Appalachia to Appalachians. And I really kind of wanted to blow that out. So rather than focusing on what's happening to Appalachians, I wanted to focus on what's happening outside of Appalachia that then comes to Appalachia and how it then integrates and works with Appalachians where they use their own agency, not have it worked upon them, to then create and develop their own modern craft identity that now 130 years later has a very much valid history and a valid heritage. So again, not criticizing anyone's past. I'm not criticizing anybody's work in the Guild at all or anyone's history. So this is a recontextualization where I'm looking outward, not inward. So rather than looking into Appalachia, I'm looking at Appalachia's craft revival and the work of the Guild in terms of national history and international history in terms of craft. So I'm very much de-regionalizing Appalachia. I am an Appalachian, and I have very strong, probably controversial opinions about the validity of Appalachia as an American region. I don't think it is. I think it's invented, and I think it gets reinforced a lot. I don't really like regionalism, and I don't really follow regional studies and historiography. I'm not that kind of history person. So I do kind of push back against that with my work. And I do believe that regionalization in American history is very much an ethno-nationalistic program. So the part of creating a national identity, part of developing an idea of who is an American, and then creating room in that definition for people from different parts of a very broad country means that you have to create sort of pluralities, but within those pluralities there's restrictions. And so that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. Also, some other themes are authenticity and heritage. I will tell you right now, I know both of those terms are incredibly important to the Guild. They're subjective. They're entirely subjective. Whose heritage, what does that mean? What is authenticity is entirely up to the person who is perceiving something as authentic or as heritage. And that does change and can change over time. And to kind of put things into context a little bit, we've got this is a snapshot from one of Francis Goodrich's many scrapbooks that are upstairs in the archives. And you can see here, it's labeled, maybe you can't read the handwriting, but this is from 1909. This is an early Allen Stand trip to New Hampshire. So this is how Allen Stand actually starts. It starts as a catalog industry, but it actually starts its sales through women's church fairs and through women's organizations. So Goodrich and other people that Goodrich was friends with in New England would take these things made by these mountain people, take them to New England, and then sell them to people that were very interested in purchasing colonial revival items. So they didn't really care so much that it came from Appalachia, they cared that it looked colonial. And that's what's going on here. And there's a lot of jumbling of regionalisms. So my thesis for this talk, and my thesis more broadly for my dissertation, I'll just read this to you, so bear with me. I call them Appalachian craft revivalists. They like to call themselves Southern Mountain Workers. They didn't revive regional craft, so it's not really a revival, so much as they adapt and develop a regionalized American craft economy to support their progressive era efforts to modernize the mountaineer. The culture of the Appalachian craft revival developed both directly and indirectly out of larger international trends that were responses to industrialization, immigration, colonialism, and nationalism. Historic events within the region, nationally and internationally, coincided with the creation and growth of the Guild to give us the sort of cosmology of the way that we understand the history of the Guild today. So today we're going to follow that history together. I'm not going to actually talk too much about the Guild. I'm going to sort of frame what's happening in the early Guild in terms of international affairs. And then the second half of the talk, I'll actually talk about international efforts of Guild members outside of the Guild. So we'll follow that history together to get a better idea of how the Guild's regionalized roots became codified and then authenticated through development of mass tourism, and how the Guild model became exportable, an exportable regionalized craft tourism model for countries, teachers, and makers around the globe, particularly post-colonial developing nations. So to start with, let's start with England. So I have a design history background. I have a global design history background, so it's hard for me to think in terms of United States history. So I am that American historian that does not stop at the contiguous borders of the United States, because we are, in fact, a colonial nation that's part of a European empire. So we have to think globally. So in terms of the modernization of craft and where we fit into craft, you have to start really with the 1851 Crystal Palace Exposition, which is the first World's Fair. And what World's Fairs are is really an industrial design showplace. So the first one is designed to show how amazing the Industrial Revolution has been for the British Empire. So they unveil things like cast iron and plate glass structures, which is why they call it the Crystal Palace Exposition. They have the world's largest steam engine in there. And then pavilions represented by countries from around the world are invited to participate and show off their best industrial and applied arts. So it really is a place for countries not just to show what they do creatively, it's really to showcase what they do economically. So there is an industrial design component there. What happened with the 1851 Crystal Expo, or Crystal Palace Expo, is that it was incredibly successful, but the designs were really bad. They were ugly. In fact, there's many articles written about how ugly the wallpapers that were displayed were, and they're bad. You should Google the wallpapers. So what happens is people go, and it's open for more than a year. It's open for a couple of years. So what happens is the next year, a group of leading art critics, bohemian, sort of outside the normal vein, artistic people like us. They got together and they said, this design for industry is all really bad. So they got together and they formed, with the help of Queen Victoria, the South Kensington Museum and School. That becomes now the V&A Museum, and so what they do is they start collecting applied arts. So it is the first and largest applied arts museum in the world. So they start collecting craft objects, or decorative arts, someone called them the lesser arts, I think, originally. Yes, the minor arts, that's right. Yes, so they go from the minor arts during this time period to the applied arts. And there's this idea of sort of industrial design moving forward by looking at designs from the past. So you sort of collect and assemble all of these older objects, and then this becomes a material design repository for students to work with so that they can stop coming up with ugly designs. And that movement is called design reform. Did you have a question? Oh, thumbs up, yeah. So this sort of stirs in the wind for about a decade or two, and then suddenly people like Pugin and Ruskin, who are art critics and philosophers, start theorizing about art for art's sake and the value of creativity, the value of aesthetics, not just in terms of like beautifying your house, but in terms of beautifying your soul and in lifting you up as a person. So there's this sort of moral, spiritual component to creativity, to living around beauty, and to incorporating the principles of good design into your life. So it's more than just a way that it is a literal way that you do things, not just in making, but a way that you live your life. And this turns into a whole system of like lived artistic experiences. The Pre-Raphaelites are part of this as well. The most famous arts and crafts people are probably William Morris. Everybody probably knows William Morris. But the most important, the most important arts and craft figure for us, for the Guild, is C.R. Ashby. So C.R. Ashby is sort of late to the game. He's like the third wave of these arts and crafts figures. He goes and studies at Toynbee Hall, which is the very first settlement house. So we all know about Pine Mountain Settlement School. Those come from a British movement called the Settlement Movement. And that settlement movement was a response to empire and industrialization. So for the first time in British history, you had people from South Asia, you had people from Africa, you had people from all over the British Empire moving into England. Not just being British subjects in other parts of the world, but being British subjects in England. So suddenly, English people stopped looking English. And they stopped speaking English, and they stopped behaving like English people. So the settlement movement was developed in a way to uplift those people and modernize them and give them the gift of British civilization. Do with that what you will. But also part of that was to introduce new sciences about hygiene, germ theory, modern living, but also ways of making, ways of still representing traditional ways of making, particularly through textile work, particularly through weaving and processing of fibers. So this idea of not completely destroying folk cultures, but adapting them, and very much, we talk about Americanization. The settlement school movement in England is very much a Britishization of British immigrants into the British Empire. So Ashby studies at that school for a while, then moves out into the countryside and establishes his own arts and crafts school, and that's specifically all that they do. It's like very fine arts and crafts. We'll see that several other people that are affiliated with the Guild will go study there. So the settlement school movement, again, is established at Toynbee Hall. That then gets replicated in the United States, first at Hull House in Chicago. There's also settlement movements that pop up in Boston. So Boston and Chicago are the heart of the American arts and crafts movement, but they're also the heart of the American progressive movement. And there's a direct tie there that never goes away. And so some of the reasons that what happens in Appalachia sort of falls under the radar, the reason that we're not talking at Grove Park Inn about this yet, is that what happens here, if there were a parallel to what happens in England, it would be related to what's called the peasant arts movement. So folk art, we've heard a lot about folk art this weekend. Folk art has a very specific periodization that not everybody agrees with, but I do. Folk art really emerges out of the turn of the 20th century effort. It is politicized vernacular art. That is what folk art is. It is because it literally comes from the idea that like the creativity, the design emerges from like the people of the earth. So it's an organic form of design, which in the 20th century Western world, it's a global culture. Like there's very few things that are developing organically out of any culture in the 20th century. So the idea of folk art is very much put that in your back pocket. Politicized vernacular design. So it has a political program behind it. What gets called folk, the people that make the folk art are the authentic people. They're the original people. And so there is an ingrained kind of looking back at your past that's part of the arts and crafts movement to identify who your original design source is. So for the British, it becomes the Anglo-Saxons. Who do you think it is for the United States? It's the British. It's a type of Anglo-Saxonism in America, which has a little bit of a different spin here that we'll get to. Before I move on, another part of that peasant arts movement is associated with Cecil Sharp, who Olive Dane Campbell was great friends with and studied with, and he starts the songcatcher movement. So he starts that folk song revival where he's going into the English countryside, he's collecting ballads. And then 5 or 10 years later, there's college-educated women in eastern Kentucky in Viper, Kentucky, talking to people with dulcimers and collecting ballads exactly the same way. So direct linkages. The image that you see here is a woodcut that another incredibly famous arts and crafts figure, Walter Crane, who brings the arts and crafts movement directly to the United States and into Boston. I think Janet had mentioned that she thought that they might have been communists. She was not wrong. They were radical socialists. So this is a decorative display. This is Britannia with her garland o' plenty around her, and this is celebrating May Day. So May Day is Labor Day, and it is a workers' holiday. And so this, you probably can't read the banner around it, but it is all about lifting up the peasants and the rights of the laborer and returning to the fields and the value of hard labor. So it's celebrating the labor of the common people. They're socialists. So the American Progressive era causes the American arts and crafts movement to look a little different. So the British arts and crafts movement is very design focused, very much high and elevated design, with the exception of the peasant arts movement, which kind of gets a little bit separated. But the American Progressive era, which lasts from 1870 to 1929, it's really led by white middle class college educated people, and it's a reaction to urbanization, industrialization, and immigration. So it's this looking back to, and it's a very resonant question to ask today, because we hear it a lot on the news. Who are the real Americans? Right, suddenly you have influxes of people coming into Ellis Island by the boatload. Cities suddenly look different. You've got people coming from rural places into urban areas. You've got people coming from the deep south to urban areas, the Great Migration from Appalachia and out of the deep south, black people moving for opportunities and to get freedom. So you have this whole shifting of populations, and it freaks out college-educated white people. It freaks out the WASPs. But they're also educated, and they've reorganized the university models, and they've developed something called the social sciences. So they think that they can understand and fix these social ills of people moving around, living in tenement housing, working in unsafe factories and child labor and all of these other things that we know about. They think they can study these things and understand them through quantitative study. So they're all social scientists. So all of our Fochdon founding moms of the Guild, they're all social scientists. They're not really craftspeople. They become craftspeople later, but most of them are scientists. They're interested in studying poverty. They're interested in studying poverty and social ills to then fix them. And craft and handmaking become one of the ways that they do that. And they get that funding through Gilded Age philanthropy. So the Gilded Age is the flip side of the Progressive era. So the Gilded Age is robber barons making all the money at the expense of all of these other laborers. So when they get old, they feel bad and they give all their money to people. A really fun story. Everybody knows the Russell Sage Foundation, but did you know that Russell Sage was not a nice person? So Russell Sage died, and his wife, who was a very nice person, used all of his money to establish a philanthropic society that helps the poor. He did not like the poor. So part of this movement, too, is eugenics and sanitation. And we often think of, there are two kinds of eugenics. There's hard eugenics and soft eugenics. Soft eugenics you see a lot, especially in the early settlement school movements. Those are things like, you'll see lots of stuff in Pine Mountain about weighing babies. and measuring babies. Also nutrition, home ec, all of these things are coming out of sort of improving the qualities of people's lives through science. That also means encouraging people to not have as many children. So that's part of birth control as well too. So there's all eugenics is not completely nasty, but it does have a sort of vein that needs to be carefully kind of talk it with a grain of salt. And one of the other things that develops out of this is the industrial and applied arts education. So we have a similar thing that happens in the United States. It doesn't happen exactly the same ways it does in the arts and crafts movement. It really is a reaction to the collapse of the apprentice system. So before this, if you were and this is where modern craft is developed. So before this, there's craft and trade. There really isn't craft in the way that we understand it today until this period. So when the apprentice system goes away, there's suddenly no way to learn the skills to do these specific kinds of craft trades. So industrial and applied arts education enters into different public school and university and college settings as a way for people to access those skills so that they can use them for industry. It will then feed into progressive era trends and find its way down here to help us, to help lift us up out of poverty. And you can see here an early, you can see here an early photo of Hull House children weaving. So arts and crafts in America actually happens a little bit earlier. It actually starts with the Centennial Expo. How many of you are weavers? How many of you know the Shuttlecraft Book of Hand Weaving? How many of you know that it's a direct copy of the John Landis pattern book? Okay, so the John Landis pattern book is in the Pennsylvania Museum. It's in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It was part of the Centennial Expo, and it's this beautiful, fully illustrated. It's not a pattern book, or it's a pattern book. It's not a weaving draft, so it's literally a thing that a customer would flip through. To decide which pattern of coverlet that they would like, and it was stunning. People had never seen anything like it. They became obsessed with it, and so people like Frances Goodrich, Mary Meigs Atwater, and Davison all kind of became obsessed with this idea of colonial weaving. And there were only a few people left that did it. So in New England, there was Weaver Rose and his sister, and that's it. They were the only hand weavers left, and they were really eccentric. And then, as we know, Frances Goodrich then discovers that there's still pockets of hand weaving in southern Appalachia, and it explodes. But we have to regionalize it. So I call this ethno-nationalism. And here's why. We've had some discussions about Scotch-Irish and Appalachian history. And I don't want to burst any bubbles, but I don't agree with that. So there are problems with the term Southern Highlands. Southern Highlands is an ethno-nationalistic term that's used to imply that the people that are Appalachian are Scottish. There are problems with that. Because there are Germans here, there are Native people here, and there are African people here from the very beginning. So to call a place by one ethnic group that's supposed to be, but actually isn't the majority, has real racial and ethnic implications that are still being continued every day, even by the sticker that's on the back of my computer. The guild was not actually founded as the Southern Highland Craft Guild. It was founded as the Southern Mountain Handicraft Guild. And I'm going to keep suggesting that we go back to that. So part of the way that Southern Highlands name is born has its own history, and it's a long history. And it actually starts all the way back in early American history. So in a letter, this is referring to people in Winchester, Virginia, early in Winchester settlement. Colonel John Bannister writes to Robert Bowling in Virginia in May of 1755, and he's speaking of people in Winchester. He says, "They're a spurious race of mortals known by the appellation," pun intended, Scotch-Irish. And so I put the sick there because Scotch-Irish is the common term, but it's really Scots-Irish. Scotch is a drink. Scotch is whiskey. So the Gilded Age, Progressive Era, social sciences, conservation, and philanthropy make their way down into the mountains, and they first pop up at Berea College. And it's actually not John C. Campbell that comes up with the term Southern Highland. It's actually Berea, and it's actually William Frost. And so he does this early map, and this is in a Berea Quarterly from 1896. So 3 years after Berea Student Industries is started. He writes this 4-page article, and it's fascinating. And he does the first map. So actually, like, John C. Campbell's map is not even the first map. It's a better map. But you can see here, it's a 9-state region. And he talks about how exciting it is to have identified this pocket of lost Americanness. So it ties into this Anglo-Saxon idea, this idea of we need to find out who the true, real, original Americans are, and they're trapped in the mountains. So we're like primitive savages with pure DNA. So it's a little problematic. So enter Berea and Allen Stand into the craft scene. So now that we've identified that there's this pocket of original Americans that need to be saved and modernized, people start coming. Progressive era reformers start pouring into the mountains. They open hundreds of schools, as we all know. They're doing different things. They're affiliated with different churches and different organizations. President Frost first introduces weaving in 1893 to the curriculum of Berea, and woodworking in 1895, and then broom making and ceramics in 1920. I thought for a minute, I got really excited and thought that Berea might have been on the front of the ceramics page, but they're about 20 years behind Alfred. But still really early in the professionalization of craft in terms of having a bachelor's degree of craft. Francis Goodrich establishes Allen Stand Cottage Industries in 1895 after teaching there for several years. We all know the famous story for being gifted the coverlet and, most importantly, the draft. And so when she gets the draft, she becomes obsessed with those. Upstairs, there's no less than 1,000 historic drafts. She took those 1,000 historic drafts, drew them all out and understood them. There's separate binders of those. And then her and Mary Meigs Atwater and Francis Davidson at different points compared notes and designed colonial revival patterns that are in a binder upstairs called Colonial Revival Patterns. And they take these historic overshot and other regional coverlet designs and turn them into things that fit into craftsman-style bungalow living. So very like modern 20th century living, but still with this design aesthetic of the past over top of it. So both Berea and Allen Stand have different models. They have different ways of thinking about craft and what they're doing. For Berea, this is providing a useful skill for students, and it's also, in Berea's mind, preserving a traditional Appalachian skill. For Francis is selling things to support her work, and it later becomes her work. So the sale of the crafts for Allen Stand is a way to support the school. The sale of crafts for Berea is a way to support the work of students. And so it's not preservation of craft. They all talk about it as preservation of craft, but they're using modern tools. They're integrating modern industrial processes, but still keeping it hand weaving. So it is a modern sort of craft reimagining of traditional skills. And it's not a regional thing that's happening. It's happening across the country at the same time. So they bring Anna Ehrenberg from New York. She's doing the same thing there. Edward Wurst is doing the same thing in Chicago. The Blue and White Needlework Society in Deerfield in New England are doing a similar thing. The Women's College at Newcomb is doing a similar thing with weaving. So like this is not happening in a vacuum. This is not just happening in Appalachia, and it's not just happening here. It's happening all over the country. But it gets regionalized and it looks different, so people think about it differently. So Pratt Institute, Frances wrote and presented her research early on in the Pratt Institute Monthly. This one's from 1898, and it's a wonderful article, and it's kind of strange to read. She writes about herself in the third person. It's kind of strange to read. And then this other article from American Monthly Review of Reviews. Again, this is put out to philanthropic. Progressive era reformers. And this article literally outlines the national efforts that are going on, of which Frances Goodrich is one part. So she's a part, along with Historic Deerfield, along with these other weaving revivals that are happening across the country in different places. She's just a part of that. And I will add that this is also happening at Hampton Institute, which Hampton Institute is one of the first HBCUs. They're not only teaching African American students how to do handicrafts, they're also teaching Native Americans, because it also integrates. It's part of this system of Indian schools to sort of kill the Indian, save the man. So they're doing double duty as well. So this is not just happening in white colleges. This is not just happening at poor colleges in Appalachia. This is not just happening at normal schools, which are teacher training colleges. This is happening at places like Yale, which is where Frances Goodrich goes and gets a certificate, because women can't get degrees from Yale yet. So she gets a fine arts certificate. But this is not something that's happening in a vacuum. It's not something that's regionalized. It's something that people that are part of a national and international community come to us to offer us. And then they work with our material culture to sort of make a profitable industry out of that. And that telling of the story gives agency to everyone, and it lifts our story up and puts us in conversation with much larger, much better researched histories in a way that I think sort of elevates what's going on here in a very real sense. Again, these are a couple more examples of the article that Goodrich wrote for the Pratt Quarterly, or for the Pratt Review. Yeah, Pratt Monthly. Here she shows a photo of a historic coverlet sample that she has collected. And on the opposing page, she shows one of these colonial revival reimaginings where she studies the historic draft. She actually studies and figures out the weaving structure. It's not the exact same structure, but she's using this as an example. Here's an old textile, and here's a way for us to repurpose this into a placemat that someone in 1909 would use on their table. So that's how it starts. But that's not how it ends. It gets even more international. So once the craft revival in Appalachia takes off, it starts to grow, there's a lot of success, there's a lot of business. So people start investing and looking for other ways to bring and expand that and modernize it in other ways. So there's lots of other international trends outside of the UK that are going on that are parallel to and related to the arts and crafts movement. Anna Ehrenberg comes to Berea in 1912. Anna Ehrenberg is Swedish. She's a Swedish weaver and a Swedish weaving instructor. She moves to New York and is a weaving instructor in New York for about 14 years. And she's recruited by Frost to come to Berea and take over their weaving program. They built her a log cabin that's 2 stories tall. It's now called it's referred to at the time as the Log Palace. It's now the Log Cabin Craft Shop. I can't remember exactly what the name is, but it's a beautiful log structure, and it does not look like a log cabin. And so not only do they bring her and give her this big house, she brings with her Scandinavian weaving structures, and most importantly, Scandinavian looms. So she brings countermarch looms instead of counterbalance looms into Appalachia for the first time. Also, jack looms come in at this time, and jack looms have a weird history that nobody fully understands. We don't really know where jack looms come from or when they originate, but they're there by the 1920s. And what a jack loom is it uses these jack pulleys to lift individual sheds. So the way that I'm a weaver. So the way that yarn works, right, you've got your warp, which is your horizontal threads held at tension. As that opens, it creates a shed that you put your shuttle through. When I say countermarch or jack or counterbalance, what I'm talking about is the way that shed opens. Sometimes just the top yarns come up, sometimes both yarns go up and down, and then sometimes the jack loom just raises one shaft at a time. So those are the different ways that sort of looms work in a nutshell. So Anna Ehrenberg comes from Sweden. So suddenly we've got Scandinavian weaving at Berea. Eleanor Vance and Charlotte Yale come to Asheville. They get that Biltmore money. And then they go to Scotland for a while on that Biltmore money. But also, those women had studied with William Fry in Cincinnati, who was the leading arts and crafts woodcarver of the United States. So they bring this very fine, English-inspired tradition of wood carving into the mountains. And if you've ever seen any early Biltmore Industries carving, it is lovely. But rather than having the botanicals that they put on those are Appalachian things. So there's lots of galax. Actually, galax is predominantly their sort of symbol. So it's these very much mountain botanicals that find their way onto these very English-looking pieces. Olive Dame Campbell and Marguerite Butler, who go on to found John C. Campbell Folk School, they apply for and receive a Russell Sage Foundation grant to do this really long Scandinavian residency. So they go to all of the Scandinavian countries and they visit a variety of different kinds of craft schools. So there's all sorts of different ways that Scandinavian countries embraced craft education and what they call popular education. The model that resonated the most with Olive was something called the Danish Folk High School. And what you're looking at is the original Danish Folk High School, which opened in 1844. So this movement is even older than the arts and crafts and design reform movement. Sorry? This one's it's pronounced Rudding. And that building is still there. It's no longer there, but this building was open until the 60s and was like the leading training school for this is kind of like the college that these people that instruct in this manner come out of. And the Danish Folk High School model is really interesting because it's a popular form of education. So their model is that it's a community organized school where the community comes together and they learn the things they want to learn from one another. They don't really bring experts in. There is no degree requirement. There is no expertise required. It really is just sort of like a community school for people to learn what they need in their own sort of community. So a kind of radical educational model. They're socialists. While they're there, they encounter some other Europeans. At this particular Danish folk school, Marguerite Butler meets a guy named Georg Beardstrup. He'll change his name to George when he comes to the United States. They get married. Spoiler alert. They also meet a guy named Leon Deschamps, and Leon Deschamps is Belgian, and he's a forestry major, or he's a forestry person. So they recruit them back in a couple of years, found John C. Campbell Folk School, and the rest is kind of Scandinavian history. Part of that too, and we'll come back to that in a minute. I don't want to run out of time or keep you all here too long, so I'm trying to speed up. They will establish a kind of blend of Appalachian traditionalism and Scandinavianness. So they incorporate folk dance and folk music into their curriculum from the very first day. It's not Appalachian, it's Danish. The Brasstown carvers, I hate to tell you, they're carving Scandinavian style stuff with Scandinavian style tools. So new tools for Appalachian craft. You can see behind you the looms that you're looking at. Those are called Ehrenberg style looms. They still look kind of old. They're much smaller. They take up way less space than a traditional loom. So you can fit more of these into a weaving studio and actually teach people to weave instead of having this massive thing you have to crawl inside of. These particular looms are only 4 shaft, and they go up to 8. And you can see a very granular image. This is Anna Ehrenberg here weaving on her Ehrenberg loom at Berea when she first gets there. And in the bottom, this is from a general arts and crafts catalog, of which there are thousands during this time period. Has anyone ever heard of Sloyd or know what Sloyd is? Okay, yeah. So Sloyd is the basis for like shop class, and it literally just means crafts. It's like hand skills, but it's a very gendered kind of hand skills. It starts with paper craft, but it's most often associated with woodworking. In the Sloyd knife and the particular shape of the blade in particular, it's not a pocket knife. There are ones that fold, but a Sloyd knife is a solid blade with a handle on it, and the knife slopes forward, and it's a specific shape of blade for carving. If you look very closely at the Brasstown carvers' hands, they're not holding pocket knives. They're holding Sloyd knives. And the director of Brasstown Carvers is Georg Bedstrup. So he's teaching them how to do this. And they're carving a very specific type of Scandinavian carving called Scandinavian flat plane carving. So it's got this kind of natural rustication to it that fits with Appalachian stereotypes. Speaking just a little bit about Vance and Yale, the two women that found Biltmore Industries and then later Tryon Toys. This is from a Tryon Toys brochure. You probably can't read this, but I'll read this one part to you. Charlotte Yale studied at Oberlin, and Sarah Kensington in Oxford in England. And spent her time learning secrets from European gypsies so that she could be fitted to teach young people in these mountains. Eleanor Vance studied 9 years under William Fry. She attended art school at South Kensington, taking Gothic design in Oxford, England. Thomas H. Kendall, who was considered England's greatest woodcarver since Grenlin Gibbons, who is an early modern woodcarver that carved for like Charles II, dressed her by making his only pupil because she intended to pass her knowledge on to the children of the North Carolina mountains. So we have a direct connection from the Arts and Crafts Training School. Sorry, that was a bad reading. It's super tiny on my screen. A direct connection between these English arts and crafts schools and the very, very early work that's going on. These are Vance and Yale are some of the earliest people to come and work in Asheville for like craft revival things. So yeah, just sort of thinking about these really direct connections. It's not even distant connections. These are direct connections. It's super important. So moving along so that we don't run completely out of time, here's a lovely photo of Alan Eaton at the 1948 Crafts Fair. So it's the first Crafts Fair. He's holding some Brasstown carvings, which I think is really fun. But the reason I put this image up is because the thing he's sitting behind is not Appalachian. It's a Scandinavian blanket. That's at the Crafts Fair, the first one. These carvings, or these images here, this just shows the inside of a Southern Highlanders being the TVA version of the Guild early on. This is part of a catalog that shows some of those carvings. You can't see them in great detail, but this is the Scandinavian flat plane carving style that I'm talking about. Traditional Scandinavian scenes will show people skiing. They're very dynamic, so it shows people often in like motion or running, and their beards will be flowing a little bit. But they're very they are planar. They're very like notched, so they're faceted kind of. We Appalachianize these, so you get lots of moonshiners, lots of like revival preachers, lots of scenes of Appalachian life. So it is very much sort of regionalizing an international craft. So the next big integration in terms of tools would be something called the Cranbrook loom. So Cranbrook Academy of Art, which is in Michigan, is started by private money, but the people that actually run the school are brought over from Sweden. And they're the Saarinens. You may know their son, who designed the airport in Washington. The person that's in charge of the textiles there is Loya Saarinen. I have a feeling that she may have woven this. I think she might have woven this blanket. I don't know for sure, but I think she might have. She designed and developed her own type of loom, and it's referred to as a Cranbrook loom. They've been commercialized now, but these were only produced at Cranbrook College for the longest time. The Schacht company made them for like 10 or 20 years in the 90s. But what you can see here is this is the 1932, which I think I actually have a copy of it over here. This is the actual Pinland Weaving Institute announcement. Edward Wurst was actually, this is the first one Edward Wurst was at. Edward Wurst was the chief hand weaving instructor in Chicago. Guess what's right there? So they have a Cranbrook loom in the Pinland Weaving Cottage in 1932. So these ladies are nationally and internationally connected. This is not a regional project. It's a project that's happening within a region, but it's not a regional project. So to kind of wrap things up quickly, 20th century historical events really changed and shaped handicraft in the Appalachian Mountains. It shaped the formation of the Guild, and it's really, I think, guided the way that we understand the Guild's past. So World War I didn't have a great impact on sort of this area. It definitely took soldiers out and men away, but at this time most of the work was being done by women. Most of the work was gendered craft. It was mostly textile focused and basket focused. There's actually a lot of writing about the early craft revival where they couldn't get the men interested. That happens later after World War II and during the Depression. So the Depression changes things. The Depression hit the Guild and craft revivalists pretty hard, but because these people were so used to making things for themselves, they started making things and selling them even harder to try to compensate for their lack of income. World War II is very, very hard for the Guild, which forms in 1930, and also very hard for people in the area that aren't associated with the Guild that make craft. But what happens after World War II is incredibly important. The GI Bill passes. The schools change focus. So Pinland, John C. Campbell, and Arrowmont, or Phi Beta Pi at that time, all change directions. They don't completely stop working with the local communities, but they look nationally. They start appealing. By this point, the history of those institutions was significant enough, they had become famous enough that they no longer had to look to local communities to bring students in. They were literally looking to train other craft teachers. And that's what this is the first start of. These weaving institutes, these are not for local North Carolinians. These are for college-educated women at first, but later men, to come learn how to weave so that they can then take this back to do occupational therapy, which we've already talked about, so that they can do things like introduce weaving curriculums to colleges, so that they can teach weaving in high school programs and normal colleges. So these are training craft educators that then go out into the nation and then into the world, not into this region. And that's happening really early on. The Korean War and then the Cold War are going to be sort of foundational for the Guild's movement forward. I do want to have just a moment to talk about this lovely figure here. She's my favorite person in the whole Guild. Sorry, anyone else that's here. That's Marion G. Hurd. She has been a lot of different things in the Guild. She's most famous, at least to me, for leading and conducting this educational study, which becomes the basis for the educational work that the Guild does today. She spends 2 years interviewing, and there's literally worksheets for every single Guild member that she spends 2 years gathering all of this information, compiles this massive report, and as you can see, this is very important. Don't throw it away. And so she compiles this, and it's funded by a federal grant in the Ford Foundation. We use this, the Guild uses this grant to develop its education program to actually professionalize, hire a real staff for the first time. This had all been volunteer members staffed before this. So this is an important step in the professionalization and growth of the Guild, which allows it to then enter into real lasting partnerships with the National Park Service, elevate itself, and really take a real step into the development of professional craft in the United States. Marion Hurd and people like her in this part of the Guild, they knew Osborne Webb. They're founding members of the American Craft Council. They're involved in the World Craft Congress as well, so like incredibly influential people, and they don't get talked about because they happen to come after World War II. So part of what happens after this World War II is that the Guild model becomes so successful because of the relationships with the National Park Service, because of things like the Davy Crockett show on the Disney Channel. Right, I mean, it's true. So the national parks become a huge tourist draw. The relationship of the Guild with those then brings in new people. They experience craft via craft tourism, and that then sort of creates a whole different set of interaction with Appalachian craft. which I argue authenticates this regionalized national history as authentically Appalachian, right? So it's during this tourism period during the 50s and 60s that the Guild really starts to define itself and its crafts as authentically Appalachian instead of maybe authentically commercially traditional. So yeah, there's this idea that like this is real. This is really traditional Appalachian craft that starts. We still do that. Not to a great extent, but we still do that. But also during that time period, we're doing lots of international work. So while the Guild is working hard to market itself as like the most Appalachian thing that's ever happened, its members are doing lots of stuff internationally. Clementine Douglas, which by the way, she does prefer Clementine, or did, she did lots of work with the Russell Sage Foundation and also the State Department to go to Hawaii and to Haiti to help them establish their own craft programs in the vein of the Guild and her work at the spinning wheel. Howard Tony Ford, the man that we saw in the very first introduction slide, he worked for the Works Progress Administration. He helped Lucy Morgan at Penland for a long time. He's a local to the Penland area. He went to college and then immediately became like a bigwig. He gets a government job. He's part of the New Deal, so he's immediately connected into like major federal channels and becomes really important for getting the Guild connected with big people. He goes to India, Lebanon, Korea, and Cambodia. He goes to Korea before the Korean War, and he goes to Cambodia before the Vietnam War. So he's in Cambodia like when it's still Indochina and it's fighting for its independence. Marion Hurd does a residency in Pakistan for 9 months, sorry. And while she's there, what she's doing is help establish the first craft program at the first women's college, or the first women's university in the newly created country of Pakistan. She's there in 1948. So she's there within a year of partition. She's also a professor at the University of Tennessee. She starts a craft education master's program through the College of Home Ec. So it's kind of hidden and off the radar because it's not housed in the fine arts department because she's a woman. But that craft department trains students from all over the world, and it lasts from 1953 until 1983 when she retires. She's the very first woman to get an honorary president. She gets like I forgot what the actual title is, but she gets an honor. She's the first woman to get an honor from the University of Tennessee, my alum, or my alma mater. She's like the most. I can't remember exactly what the title is, but it's like she's the most impressive female professor they've ever had. Muriel Martin, Irene Bowden go with her a lot too. They're also they're international figures, both with John C. Campbell, and Irene is also at John C. Campbell. And they go with her on numerous Scandinavian tours that she hosts every year through the University of Tennessee. And those courses are offered nationally to craft educators around the country to go on this trip that's sponsored by the leading craft revival organization in the country. I'm going to skip Gene Stang and Tony Landrau, but if you all want to talk about those with me later, they're really important figures. So because we're running out of time, and I do want to make sure we all have a chance to see the books and leave, so I just want to talk a little bit about the stakes and conclusions. So I do argue that this is a regionalized part of the arts and crafts movement that falls under the radar because it's not artsy enough. It's not because the Guild works and the craft work that the early revivalists and then the Guild do is very much trying to look Appalachian. It's trying to identify as Appalachian. It gets overlooked by the arts and crafts people who see that as sort of below their design standards, even though it's the same kind of work and it's coming out of the same kind of theoretical models. Heritage, history, and contemporary craft. Heritage craft here is incredibly important. But we have a longer, and I would argue bigger, history of being innovators in contemporary craft, in professionalization of contemporary craft in the United States. We have incredibly important studio craft histories here that sort of take second fiddle to the earlier histories that, again, sort of have their roots in this regionalization and sort of exclusive identification of a region with one ethnic group. There are, again, as we've seen, tons and tons, and I could go on and on and on, about the international and industrial influences on the craft cultures that develop out of the Appalachian craft revival, and again, ethno-nationalism. Southern Highlands, it's not a nice term. That's it. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate everything. Thank you all so much.